The Pacific Ocean crashed against the cliffs below Horizon Point Research Facility with the same relentless rhythm it had maintained for millennia, indifferent to the fact that the world above had descended into a nightmare that would have seemed impossible just 6 months earlier. Lieutenant Marcus Webb stood on the reinforced observation deck, his weathered hands gripping binoculars that had become extensions of his own eyes, scanning the treeline where the coastal highway disappeared into a tangle of abandoned vehicles and creeping wilderness. The facility had once been a beacon of cutting-edge environmental research, a glass and steel monument to human innovation perched on the California coastline, but now it served as a fortress for the 47 souls who had managed to survive the initial outbreak and the chaos that followed. Marcus lowered the binoculars and glanced at his watch, the mechanical tick somehow reassuring in a world where so much had stopped working, where power grids had failed and communication networks had gone silent, leaving isolated pockets of humanity to wonder if they were truly alone. Behind him, he could hear the familiar sounds of the facility coming to life with the morning shift change. Dr. Elizabeth Morgan's voice carrying from the medical wing as she instructed her small team, the clang of tools from the maintenance level where Jacob Reynolds and his crew worked tirelessly to keep their generators running, and the soft footfalls of Rachel Martinez making her rounds to check the security of every entrance point, every reinforced door and barricaded window that stood between them and the things that had once been human. Marcus had been a Marine Corps officer before the fall, trained for combat and crisis management, but nothing in his extensive military experience had prepared him for the reality of fighting an enemy that felt no pain, feared no death, and possessed an inexhaustible hunger that drove them forward with mindless determination. The infected had appeared first in the major cities, or at least that's where the news reports had focused before the media went dark, spreading through the densely populated areas like wildfire through dry brush, transforming victims into predators within hours of infection. The facility's isolation had been their salvation initially, giving them precious time to fortify their position while the world collapsed, but Marcus knew their luck couldn't hold forever. He raised the binoculars again, adjusting the focus on a section of fence line near the northern perimeter, and his blood turned to ice as he saw what his instincts had been warning him about for the past 3 days. They were coming. Not the scattered individuals or small groups that occasionally wandered close enough to be put down quietly, but a mass of shuffling bodies emerging from the tree line, dozens of them, perhaps more than 100, moving with that characteristic awkward gait that would have been almost comical if it weren't so terrifying. Marcus keyed his radio with practiced efficiency, keeping his voice calm and measured even as his heart rate accelerated. "This is Webb. We have a situation at the north perimeter, multiple hostiles approaching. This is not a drill. All personnel to defensive positions immediately." The response was instantaneous as the facility transformed from a quiet morning routine into a coordinated defensive operation, the result of countless drills and the harsh lessons learned from smaller incursions. Thomas Chin rushed past him toward the armory, followed by sisters Amanda and Patricia Cole, who had become 2 of their best marksmen despite never having fired a weapon before the outbreak. Dr. Morgan appeared at his elbow, her stethoscope still hanging around her neck, her face pale but determined as she asked the question Marcus had been dreading. "How many?" He handed her the binoculars without a word, watching her face as she counted the approaching horde, seeing the moment when she understood the magnitude of what they were facing. "Marcus, that's more than we've ever dealt with," she said quietly, and he could hear the fear beneath her professional composure, the same fear that gnawed at his own gut. "I know," he replied, checking his rifle with automatic precision, the weapon that had become as familiar as his own heartbeat. "But we don't have anywhere else to go, Elizabeth. This facility is our home now, our last horizon, and if we lose it, we lose everything." The sound of the first moan carried on the ocean breeze, that distinctive inhuman sound that haunted the nightmares of every survivor, and Marcus knew that the relative safety they had maintained for 6 months was about to be tested in ways that would either forge them into something stronger or break them completely. The northern fence had held for exactly 43 minutes before the sheer weight of decomposing bodies pressing against the chain link caused the support posts to buckle and collapse inward like dominoes falling in slow motion. Marcus had ordered the first fallback position activated while Thomas Wright and his team laid down covering fire from the second-floor windows, their rifle shots creating a steady percussion that echoed across the facility grounds. The plan had always been to defend Horizon Point to the last, but plans changed when reality came shambling through your perimeter with outstretched arms and gnashing teeth that hungered for living flesh. Dr. Elizabeth Morgan had made the call that Marcus knew was coming but had hoped to avoid, her voice cutting through the chaos on the radio with clinical precision that barely masked her desperation. "Marcus, we have breaches on the lower maintenance level. They're coming through the ventilation tunnels. We didn't account for them squeezing through spaces that small." The facility that had seemed like an impenetrable fortress was suddenly revealed as a complex maze of potential entry points, each one a doorway for death to come pouring through. The evacuation order went out at 1400 hours, exactly 6 months to the day since they had first barricaded themselves inside what they had foolishly believed would be their permanent sanctuary. Jacob Reynolds had the convoy vehicles ready within 20 minutes, 3 heavy-duty trucks and 2 SUVs that had been maintained obsessively for precisely this nightmare scenario, their fuel tanks topped off with the precious gasoline they had been hoarding from nearby abandoned stations. The loading process was controlled chaos as people grabbed the emergency packs they had prepared but never truly believed they would need, essential supplies thrown into vehicles while the sounds of breaking glass and splintering wood grew closer with each passing second. Rachel Martinez directed the evacuation with the efficiency of a seasoned commander, her background as a high school principal translating surprisingly well into organizing people under extreme pressure, making sure that every person was accounted for and every critical resource was secured. Marcus was overseeing the rear guard when young Timothy Fletcher, barely 19 and still looking like the college freshman he had been when the world ended, came running from the research wing with wild eyes and gasping breath. "Lieutenant Webb, Dr. Morgan says there's data we can't leave behind, research about the infection. She says it might be the key to understanding how this started." Marcus wanted to scream that understanding didn't matter when you were about to be torn apart by a flood of infected, but he saw Patricia Cole already sprinting toward the research wing with a tactical bag, her sister Amanda providing cover as 3 zombies stumbled around the corner near the cafeteria entrance. The convoy pulled out at 1432, leaving behind the facility that had been their home and their hope, watching in the rearview mirrors as the infected swarmed over the building like ants consuming a fallen piece of fruit. Marcus drove the lead vehicle with Elizabeth beside him clutching a laptop and several hard drives that apparently contained information worth risking lives to retrieve, while Jacob handled the rear truck, his CB radio keeping the convoy connected as they navigated the coastal highway heading north toward what remained of the small town of Mendocino. The rumor of a safe zone had come 3 weeks earlier from a passing survivor they had traded supplies with, a grizzled former park ranger named Dennis Hawthorne who claimed there was an organized community in the mountains, fortified and actively recruiting people with useful skills. Marcus had been skeptical of such claims because hope was a dangerous thing in the wasteland America had become, a way to get yourself killed chasing mirages across an infected landscape, but now that Horizon Point was lost, that distant rumor was the only destination they had. The highway was a graveyard of vehicles and dreams, abandoned cars creating an obstacle course that forced them to reduce speed and weave between rusted metal coffins that still contained the skeletal remains of people who had died fleeing north when the outbreak first began. Amanda Cole's voice crackled over the radio from the middle SUV, tense and urgent. "We've got movement in the tree line, multiple contacts pacing us on the western side." Marcus gripped the steering wheel tighter and pressed the accelerator, knowing that stopping meant death and that somewhere ahead in the approaching darkness lay either salvation or just another way to die, but movement was life and stillness was surrender, so they drove deeper into the wasteland with the endless night following close behind, hungry and patient and absolutely inevitable. The settlement called itself New Eden, which should have been Marcus Webb's first warning sign because nothing good ever came from people naming things after paradise in a world that had become hell on earth. They had driven for 3 days through increasingly treacherous terrain, losing precious fuel and nearly losing Patricia Cole when she had ventured too far from the convoy during a supply stop and found herself cornered by 4 infected in what remained of a roadside diner. The fortified community appeared like a mirage in the mountain valley, surrounded by impressive walls constructed from shipping containers and reinforced concrete, with guard towers manned by armed sentries who actually looked well-fed and alert rather than the half-starved desperate survivors Marcus had expected to find. The gates opened after a tense 20-minute negotiation during which Marcus and Elizabeth were required to approach unarmed while the rest of their group waited in the vehicles, hands visible, being studied through rifle scopes by watchers who took security seriously enough to make Marcus cautiously optimistic. The man who greeted them introduced himself as Councilman Richard Brennan, a former city planner whose soft hands and clean clothes seemed almost obscene in a world where everyone else looked like they had been dragged through miles of hard road and harder choices. Brennan's smile was warm and practiced as he explained that New Eden housed nearly 200 survivors, complete with electricity generated by solar panels and a small hydroelectric system, gardens that provided fresh vegetables, and even livestock that had been carefully transported and protected during the chaos of the collapse. It seemed too good to be true, which Marcus knew from hard experience usually meant it was exactly that, but Elizabeth's face showed such naked hope at the prospect of hot showers and real beds that he kept his suspicions to himself as their convoy was guided through the outer gates into an inner compound that looked like a slice of the old world preserved in amber. The community assigned them to a processing center where a cheerful woman named Helen Vasquez explained the rules and integration procedures with the enthusiasm of a resort activities director, talking about job assignments and resource sharing and communal meals while Timothy Fletcher looked around with wide eyes like a kid seeing Disneyland for the first time. They were given actual housing, small prefabricated units that were clean and secure, and that first night Marcus lay on a real mattress listening to the silence and feeling his military instincts screaming that something was fundamentally wrong even though he couldn't identify what it was. The next 3 days passed in a blur of orientation sessions and work assignments, with Jacob Reynolds joining the engineering team that maintained the power systems, Rachel Martinez beginning to work with the community's education program for the dozen children who lived within the walls, and the Cole sisters being evaluated for the security force that Brennan commanded with military precision despite never having served a day in uniform. It was Dr. Elizabeth Morgan who first voiced the concern that Marcus had been circling around like a shark sensing blood in dark water. She found him on the fourth evening near the eastern wall where he had been studying the guard rotations and patrol patterns, her face troubled in the fading light as she spoke quietly enough that her words wouldn't carry to the nearest sentry posted 30 yards away. "Marcus, I've been working in their medical facility, and something doesn't add up about their supply situation. They have medications that should have expired months ago still in regular use, and when I asked about their pharmaceutical storage protocols, the head physician changed the subject so smoothly I almost didn't notice." Marcus nodded slowly, his own observations beginning to form a pattern that made his stomach turn with dark possibilities. "The food situation bothers me too. They claim to be self-sufficient with their gardens and livestock, but I've done the math on agricultural yields and animal breeding cycles, and the numbers don't support the caloric intake I'm seeing. 200 people eating this well would require resources they simply don't have visible anywhere in this compound." That night, Marcus assembled a quiet meeting with Jacob, Rachel, and the Cole sisters in his assigned unit, speaking in whispers about the inconsistencies they had all noticed but been too grateful for comfort to question immediately, the unexplained supply runs that left the compound at irregular intervals, the restricted sections of the community that residents were told to avoid without adequate explanation, and the disturbing fact that no one ever seemed to talk about where they had come from or what they had done to survive before finding New Eden, as if the past was a forbidden subject that might shatter the careful illusion of normalcy they had constructed in the mountains. The truth about New Eden revealed itself at 2 a.m. when Marcus Webb followed Councilman Richard Brennan's supply truck through the eastern gate on what was supposed to be a routine perimeter check. What he discovered in the valley below the settlement made every instinct he possessed scream with revulsion and a sick understanding of how New Eden had maintained its prosperity while the rest of the world starved and suffered. The supply runs weren't scavenging missions to abandoned towns or carefully planned raids on military depots as Brennan had claimed during the community meetings. Instead, Marcus watched through his binoculars as Brennan's team systematically lured a small group of survivors toward what appeared to be a safe entrance, then trapped them in a kill box where they were efficiently eliminated and their supplies confiscated, their bodies left for the infected that were drawn by the noise like sharks to chum in bloody water. The settlement wasn't a haven for survivors, it was a predator that fed on the desperate and the hopeful, using the appearance of civilization to rob and murder anyone weak enough to fall for the illusion. Marcus made it back through the gates before Brennan's crew returned, his mind racing through scenarios and strategies, knowing that his group needed to leave immediately but also knowing that Brennan wouldn't simply allow them to walk away with the knowledge of what New Eden truly was beneath its carefully maintained facade. He woke Elizabeth first, then systematically roused the others, speaking in urgent whispers about what he had witnessed and watching their faces transform from sleepy confusion to horrified understanding to grim determination. The evacuation plan was hastily constructed and desperately flawed, relying on Jacob Reynolds creating a distraction with the power systems while Marcus and Thomas Wright secured 2 of their original vehicles that had been parked in the motor pool under the guise of maintenance and fuel efficiency checks. They were loading supplies stolen from New Eden's warehouses, justified theft from thieves and murderers, when young Timothy Fletcher came running from the southern wall with news that eclipsed even the immediate danger of their escape attempt. "Lieutenant Webb, You need to see this now, all of you, because we're not going to make it out the east gate or any gate if we don't do something about what's coming. Marcus followed Timothy up the ladder to the southern observation post and felt his blood turn to ice as he surveyed the valley below where the highway stretched toward the distant ruins of what had once been a thriving mountain town. The horde that approached wasn't measured in dozens or even hundreds, but in thousands upon thousands of shuffling bodies that filled the road and spilled into the surrounding forest like a river of death flowing inexorably northward. The endless march of infected stretched back as far as the eye could see in the pre-dawn darkness, a migration of the dead drawn by some instinct or stimulus that Marcus couldn't begin to understand, and New Eden lay directly in their path. The alarm bells began ringing across the settlement as other sentries spotted the approaching catastrophe, and within minutes Councilman Brennan was on the wall screaming orders to his security force while the general population stumbled from their quarters in various states of panic and confusion. Marcus saw his opportunity and his nightmare simultaneously, because the horde would provide cover for their escape but it would also likely kill everyone in New Eden regardless of their crimes, and he found himself facing the impossible choice between saving murderers and thieves or leaving them to the fate they had arguably earned through their predatory actions. Elizabeth grabbed his arm as he stood frozen with indecision, her voice cutting through his moral paralysis with the clarity of someone who had already made peace with the price of survival. We take our people and anyone who wants to come with us, we go north through the mountain pass while that horde is focused on the main settlement, and we let Brennan and his council face the consequences of building their paradise on the bones of innocent people. The group split in the chaos that followed, with Marcus leading 17 people including his core team plus 5 New Eden residents who had figured out what their leadership truly was and wanted no part of it, while Rachel Martinez made the stunning decision to stay behind with a dozen others who believed they could help defend the innocent families trapped in the settlement regardless of what Brennan had done. The last image Marcus had of New Eden was Rachel standing on the wall beside Amanda Cole who had refused to leave without helping the children, both women firing methodically into the leading edge of the horde that crashed against the southern barriers like a tsunami of rotting flesh and insatiable hunger, buying time for an evacuation that might already be too late. The mountain pass was a treacherous nightmare of switchbacks and crumbling asphalt that had never been designed for the heavy trucks Marcus Webb's diminished group now pushed to their mechanical limits, climbing higher into elevations where the air grew thin and cold and the infected seemed mercifully absent, as if even the dead couldn't manage the steep grade and oxygen deprivation. They had been driving for 6 hours since fleeing New Eden, the sound of gunfire and screaming fading behind them into a haunted memory that would join all the other horrors they carried like stones in their hearts. Marcus couldn't stop thinking about Rachel Martinez and Amanda Cole, two of the best people he had ever known, choosing to stand and fight for strangers rather than run toward uncertain safety, and the weight of that decision pressed on him like a physical burden even though he knew they had made their choice freely and with full understanding of the cost. Elizabeth Morgan sat beside him in the lead truck, her laptop balanced on her knees and powered by a portable battery pack, her fingers flying across the keyboard as she analyzed the research data she had risked everything to retrieve from Horizon Point, cross-referencing infection patterns and cellular degradation rates with a focus that seemed almost manic in its intensity. Behind them, the convoy had shrunk to just 2 vehicles carrying 17 exhausted souls who had lost their homes twice in the span of a week and were running on nothing but stubborn determination and the rapidly fading hope that somewhere in this dead world there was still a place for the living. Timothy Fletcher drove the second truck with Jacob Reynolds riding shotgun, while Thomas Wright and Patricia Cole maintained watch through the rear windows for any signs of pursuit from either the living or the dead, though the mountain wilderness seemed eerily empty of both. They made camp that night in an abandoned ranger station perched on a ridge that offered commanding views of the approach routes and enough defensive positions to give Marcus a slim margin of comfort as he set the watch rotation. Elizabeth barely noticed the stop, her attention consumed by the data streaming across her screen, occasionally muttering to herself about protein sequences and mutation rates and viral adaptation patterns that meant nothing to Marcus but seemed to hold her in a state of barely controlled excitement. It was Thomas Wright who finally convinced her to eat something, bringing her a plate of their carefully rationed food and refusing to leave until she took at least a few bites, his concern for the doctor obvious in the gentle way he monitored her health even as she protested that her work was too important to interrupt. Around midnight, Elizabeth emerged from the ranger station with her laptop clutched against her chest and her eyes bright with something Marcus hadn't seen in months, actual genuine hope that looked almost painful in its intensity. She gathered everyone who wasn't on watch, speaking quietly so her voice wouldn't carry beyond their small circle in the cold mountain darkness. The research we conducted at Horizon Point, the environmental studies we were running before the outbreak, they weren't just about climate patterns and ocean temperatures. We were tracking unusual bacterial concentrations in deep water samples, something that shouldn't have existed at those depths and pressures. Her hands trembled slightly as she turned the laptop screen to show them images and charts that looked like abstract art to Marcus's untrained eye. I think I've found the source, or at least the catalyst for the infection. It's not entirely biological. It's a symbiotic relationship between a mutated bacterial strain and what appears to be a form of parasitic organism that was released from melting permafrost in the Arctic regions. The infection doesn't just kill the host, it rewrites fundamental cellular processes to create a mobile incubator for continued parasitic reproduction. Jacob Reynolds leaned forward, his engineer's mind grasping for practical applications. If you understand how it works, can you stop it? Can you create a cure or a vaccine or something that kills the infection without killing the host? Elizabeth's expression shifted from excitement to something more complicated, a mixture of hope and heartbreak that Marcus recognized from too many battlefield medical situations where understanding came too late to save the dying. Not a cure, not with the resources we have available, but possibly a preventative treatment, something that could inoculate uninfected individuals and potentially, if we can find a proper laboratory with the right equipment, a way to disrupt the parasitic life cycle on a large scale. She paused, and Marcus saw the weight of what she was about to say settling across her shoulders like a physical burden. But I need equipment that only exists in high-level research facilities, the kind that are located in major cities that are now completely overrun with millions of infected. The city of Sacramento rose from the valley floor like a monument to extinction, its skyline still intact but its streets filled with a writhing mass of infected that numbered in the tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands, a concentration of death that defied comprehension and made Marcus Webb's previous encounters with the undead seem like minor skirmishes in comparison. The University of California Davis Medical Center sat on the northern edge of the urban sprawl, its research laboratories containing the equipment that Dr. Elizabeth Morgan insisted was their only chance to develop the preventative treatment that could save what remained of humanity from eventual extinction. The plan was insane, which Marcus acknowledged freely during the 3 days they spent in the foothills preparing and scouting approach routes using binoculars and topographical maps that were probably outdated even before the world ended. They would go in light and fast, a small team of 6 people including Marcus, Elizabeth, Jacob Reynolds, Thomas Wright, Patricia Cole, and surprisingly Timothy Fletcher, who had transformed from a frightened college kid into someone who understood that courage wasn't the absence of fear but the willingness to act despite being absolutely terrified. The remaining 11 survivors would maintain a fallback position with the vehicles at a fortified warehouse on the city outskirts, ready to evacuate if the extraction team didn't return within the 12-hour window they had calculated as the maximum sustainable time for the operation. They entered Sacramento at dawn, using a drainage canal system that Jacob had identified on city planning documents, moving through concrete tunnels that echoed with their footsteps and the distant moaning of infected who wandered the streets above their heads in endless mindless patterns. The medical center appeared abandoned when they emerged 6 blocks from their entry point, but Marcus knew better than to trust appearances in a world where death waited behind every corner and inside every shadowed doorway. The ground floor was a charnel house of dried blood and scattered remains, the evidence of panicked evacuation attempts and desperate last stands that had failed when the infection reached critical mass and overwhelmed even the most determined resistance. They moved through the corridors in tactical formation, Marcus on point with Patricia covering their rear, every nerve ending screaming with tension as they climbed the emergency stairwell toward the 7th-floor research laboratories that Elizabeth had identified as containing the specific equipment she needed. The laboratory complex was miraculously intact, sealed behind security doors that had held against the infected but now required Jacob's engineering skills to bypass without triggering alarms that might still be functional enough to draw every zombie in the building down on their position. Elizabeth went to work immediately once they breached the lab, identifying equipment and beginning the careful process of disconnecting and packing the delicate instruments while Marcus and Thomas maintained security at the 2 entrance points and Patricia helped Jacob rig a pulley system to lower their acquired equipment down the exterior of the building to avoid carrying it through the infected-filled hallways. They were 90 minutes into the operation when Timothy Fletcher, who had been monitoring the stairwell, came running into the lab with his face pale and his voice cracking with controlled panic as he reported that infected were flooding up from the lower levels, drawn by something he couldn't identify but coming in numbers that would overwhelm their defensive position within minutes. Marcus made the decision that would haunt him for whatever remained of his life, ordering Elizabeth and Jacob to continue packing the essential equipment while he, Thomas, Patricia, and Timothy created a defensive choke point in the corridor outside the laboratory, using overturned gurneys and medical equipment to create a barrier that funneled the infected into a killing zone where headshots were the only currency that mattered. The battle that followed was a descent into a nightmare realm where time lost meaning and existence compressed into the mechanical cycle of aim, fire, reload, and repeat while the bodies piled higher and the infected kept coming with that inexorable patience that characterized the dead who had literally nothing but time. Thomas Wright went down first when 3 infected broke through the barrier simultaneously, overwhelming him before Marcus could provide supporting fire, and the big man's last act was detonating a grenade that cleared the immediate corridor but also collapsed part of the ceiling and cut off their planned escape route. Patricia Cole took a bite to her shoulder while pulling Marcus back from an infected that had grabbed his tactical vest, and she looked him in the eyes with absolute clarity as she raised her pistol to her own temple and whispered that she wouldn't turn into one of those things before Marcus could stop her. When Jacob finally shouted that they had everything Elizabeth needed, Marcus and Timothy retreated into the laboratory with perhaps 30 seconds before the infected overwhelmed their position, and Jacob's desperate solution was the exterior window and a rappelling rope that might hold their weight for the 7-story descent or might send them plummeting to death on the pavement below. The rope held for exactly 6.5 stories before the anchor point tore free from the window frame, sending Marcus Webb, Elizabeth Morgan, Jacob Reynolds, and Timothy Fletcher into a free fall that ended in a dumpster filled with medical waste bags that were disgusting beyond description but soft enough to prevent the fatal impact that would have ended their mission and their lives simultaneously. They hit the ground running with infected pouring from every exit of the medical center, Elizabeth clutching a backpack containing equipment worth more than gold in a world where hope had become the scarcest resource of all. The extraction back through the drainage system was a blur of desperate flight and close calls, with Jacob taking a fall that twisted his ankle badly enough that Timothy had to support half his weight while Marcus provided rear guard against the infected that had somehow found their way into the tunnel system. They emerged at the fallback position to find their remaining survivors engaged in a firefight with a group of hostile scavengers who had apparently decided the warehouse and its supplies were easier targets than venturing into the city proper. But the arrival of Marcus's team from an unexpected direction turned the tide quickly and the attackers melted away into the ruins rather than face a protracted battle they were no longer guaranteed to win. The journey back into the mountains took 4 days, slowed by Jacob's injury and the need for extreme caution with the precious equipment they had paid for in blood and lives that could never be replaced. Elizabeth worked during every stop, jury-rigging a makeshift laboratory in the back of one truck, running tests and synthesizing compounds using chemicals and supplies they scavenged from veterinary clinics and abandoned pharmacies along their route. It was on the 3rd night, camped in the shell of a burned-out high school, that she successfully created the first viable dose of what she called the inoculation serum, a preventative treatment that wouldn't cure the infected but could potentially protect the uninfected from succumbing to the parasitic organism even after exposure to infected blood or bodily fluids. Timothy Fletcher volunteered to be the first test subject, rolling up his sleeve with the same quiet courage he had shown in Sacramento, and Elizabeth administered the injection with hands that shook slightly as she explained that they wouldn't know if it worked unless he was actually exposed to the infection, a prospect that made Marcus's stomach turn with the weight of what they were asking this young man to risk. The answer came sooner than any of them wanted when their convoy was ambushed by infected while navigating a narrow canyon road, and Timothy took a deep slash across his forearm from a zombie's broken fingernails, the kind of contact that had meant certain death and transformation since the outbreak began. They restrained him as a precaution, watching with held breath as hours passed and Timothy remained himself, his vital signs stable and his mental state coherent, showing none of the rapid deterioration that characterized the infection's typical progression. Elizabeth drew blood samples every 2 hours, her testing confirming that while the parasitic organisms had entered his bloodstream, they were being systematically destroyed by his enhanced immune response, the inoculation working exactly as her research had predicted. The celebration was subdued, tempered by the memory of all those they had lost to reach this moment, but Marcus saw something in his people's eyes that had been absent for too long, actual tangible hope based not on rumors or desperate wishes but on verifiable scientific achievement. They found Rachel Martinez 3 weeks later, discovered by pure chance when their radio scanning picked up a distress call from a settlement in the northern forests. She had survived New Eden's fall along with Amanda Cole and 8 others including 6 children, fighting their way out during the chaos and establishing a small fortified camp in what had once been a summer retreat for church groups. The reunion was emotional beyond words, and Rachel's face when Elizabeth explained about the inoculation serum showed the same hope Marcus had seen spreading through their group like dawn breaking after an endless night. They consolidated their 2 groups into a community of 37 survivors, establishing a permanent base in the mountain facility that offered natural defenses and access to clean water. Elizabeth set up her laboratory in what had been a chapel, the irony not lost on anyone that the potential salvation of humanity was being developed in a place dedicated to faith and miracles. Marcus stood on the deck overlooking the valley 6 months after escaping Horizon Point, watching the sun rise over a world still filled with infected and danger, but also filled with 37 people who had survived when survival seemed impossible, who had found hope when hope was the rarest commodity in existence. They had lost so much and so many, paid prices that would echo through whatever remained of their lives, but they had also discovered that the human spirit was harder to kill than anyone had imagined, that even when facing the endless night, there were those who would continue fighting for the fragile promise of a new dawn.